Namaste, my dear brothers and sisters. The love and blessings of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo to all of you from Sri Aurobindo Ashram, Delhi branch. Subject today is the how the brain perceives things and then does whatever follows that perception. Preaching and practice sort of, the nervous system decides on the basis of what it perceives, what to do, and not only preaches but also puts it into practice. So that is the idea behind the title, how the brain perceives and then preaches and puts into practice. What I'll do is uh, just give you a little introduction to the subject. The perception of or the environment around us or what is happening within the body is based on receptors. And here the term receptors, why I'm saying here the term receptors, because we use receptors in many different ways. Unfortunately, in life sciences, you might have heard me talking very often about receptors for hormones. But here, this we are talking of another type of receptors, not the receptors for hormones, but structures which are particularly sensitive to a certain variety of change in the environment. Some receptors may be sensitive to temperature, some to pressure, and some to light, some to sound. Now, these are the types of specialized cells which have become specially sensitive to one particular type of stimulus, and we call these also receptors. So the story of perception starts with a certain change in the environment, which stimulates one of these receptors. And once the receptor has been stimulated, then it travels via a nerve fiber to the spinal cord. And from the spinal cord, as we saw the other day, it can initiate a reflex action. That is, it can have a small circuitry within the spinal cord, and back comes in the uh, motor fiber through another neuron, that is the fiber that conveys the message out of the spinal cord to, say, a skeletal muscle. And as a result, the muscle contracts. For example, if you uh, place your finger accidentally on a pin, the pin prick uh, stimulates the pain receptors, and that pain receptor then carries this from the nerve fiber starting from this pain receptor, takes the message to the spinal cord, and there it initiates the stimulation of another neuron which supplies the muscle, which will make the hand withdraw itself, and that's how the muscle contracts. But then that's not all what happens as a result of the stimulation of the receptor. There's also a longer pathway which is simultaneously put into action, and that takes it right up to the cerebral cortex so that we can perceive the stimulus. So this is the sort of a usual scheme. And how this happens is that initially when the receptor is stimulated, the type of energy that the receptor has is converted into electrical energy. So this is what we call transduction, that is converting one form of energy into another. So whether the receptor has been stimulated by a mechanical receptor or mechanical stimulus or by a light stimulus or whatever type of stimulus it has been stimulated by, if that was appropriate for that receptor, then this receptor converts this energy of the stimulus into an electrical energy. It's into electrical language. And it's in that form that it travels to the spinal cord. And then from there, it continues in that language till it is finally translated into a reflex or into a subjective experience of what actually has stimulated. So, with this general scheme, which applies not only to receptors in the skin, like those for touch or pressure or temperature, it applies also to specialized receptors like those in the eyes and the ears, although we call them special senses, but the basic mechanism remains the same. There also we have receptors which get stimulated by an appropriate stimulus, light in the case of the eyes, sound in the case of the ears, and then this travels to the uh, travels to initiate a reflex through the central nervous system and also travels up to help us perceive the reflex. So with this background, let me now go to the digital board. So for simplicity, we'll stick to the skin receptors most of the time. And in the skin, we'll take up some of the simplest receptors, which are the free nerve endings. The free nerve endings are have the receptors for pain and temperature. Why we call them free nerve endings is because in contrast, we have other types of receptors which are a little more specialized. And say, I mean, let me just sort of draw it to make it look simpler. So say this is the if this is the spinal cord. Now this is the skin, and in the skin we have this type of free nerve ending, which itself acts as a receptor for pain and temperature. But in contrast, we also have in the skin some specialized receptors, like say this one. This type of receptor is what we call a Pacinian corpuscle, and it has these onion-like layers, which one can understand makes it more easy for this type of a receptor to perceive pressure. And within this, of course, there will be a nerve ending, which then conveys the information to the spinal cord. So for simplicity, we shall stick to the free nerve endings. So suppose a free nerve ending in the skin has been stimulated. Now, this is sensitive to, say, temperature. It has been stimulated, and once you apply, say, a warm stimulus here, or if it's a pain nerve ending, a painful stimulus here, then that could have varying intensities. It could be mild or it could be severe. Now, how does this get translated into different types of electrical energy? To start with, at the receptor level, it translates in a very simple way. There is an electrical change. Whatever the type of stimulus, it's converted into electrical language. So there's an electrical change here at the receptor. And that electrical, the magnitude of that electrical change is proportional to the stimulus. So if the change is of this type for a weak stimulus, say if this is a weak stimulus, it leads to this type of a change. A strong stimulus, say this is a strong stimulus, leads to a bigger change. And when this change crosses a certain threshold, then only the nerve impulses will travel along this nerve, which means a very mild stimulus may not be perceived at all. So if this is below the threshold, it will not be perceived. But once it crosses the threshold, then an electrical change will take place here, uh, which is of a different type. That is not graded. That's an all or none type of a response. That is either uh, that electrical change takes place in this nerve fiber, it travels along this nerve fiber, or it doesn't take place at all. So that's an all or none. Whereas here, the change that takes place is a graded process, and the magnitude is proportional to the strength of the stimulus. So the coding of the strength of the stimulus at the receptor level is through the magnitude of the change that takes place. And this takes place at the receptor. So this is therefore called the receptor potential. So the receptor potential is related in its magnitude to the intensity of the stimulus. But then if this is an all or none response, do we have no code at all here? After that, then what happens? How do we finally perceive the strength of the stimulus? That happens because here that is changed into another type of language, and that is the frequency. So a mild stimulus will be perceived, will travel at this frequency, whereas a strong stimulus will travel at this frequency. So the frequency of the change here, which is all or none in character, depends upon the magnitude of the stimulus. So the code changes here. Here it was the magnitude of the electrical change. And if it crossed a certain threshold, then an all or none electrical change uh, travels along this nerve fiber, and the frequency with which that electrical change takes place is proportional to the intensity of the stimulus. So the code changes. And then it is then this goes to the spinal cord. So here's the spinal cord. The cell body of this neuron is just outside the spinal cord, and then it enters here. And one thing that it does is to stimulate a reflex, a contraction of a muscle, but then simultaneously, it also goes up and finally reaches the cerebral cortex, where it where once it reaches there, then we are able to perceive the stimulus. And along with that, what happens is that along with this specific projection, which leads to the perception of the presence of the stimulus and its intensity and its localization, along with that, what also happens is that there is a diffuse projection all over the cortex. So that's a specific pathway which carries it to a particular point in the cerebral cortex so that we are able to perceive the nature of the stimulus, that is what modality it is, what's pain or temperature, where it is located in the body, and what its intensity is. So that much we are able to make out from here. But then along with that, there's also a diffuse projection throughout the cortex, which leads to arousal. And that's what contributes in one way to keeping us awake. And conversely, when there is no stimulus going or very few stimuli going from the surroundings, that arousal will not take place, and therefore we tend to fall asleep. So that explains the common experience that we fall asleep more easily when the when we fall asleep more easily when there is no stimulus in the surroundings. So in a way, we can say that there are three types of fate that the stimulus has. One is to lead to a reflex action. Second is to lead to a specific projection in the cerebral cortex, which makes us aware of the type of stimulus it is, where it is located in the body, and what its intensity is. And the third is a diffuse projection to a widespread area in the cortex, which keeps us awake. Now, what about the specific pathway? That's what we shall concentrate on. Now, the specific pathway takes it to a place in this brain Now, if you look at the surface of the brain, it has many convolutions. And you can see these grooves here. Now, the central groove here is called the central sulcus. And this is the back side. And this is the front. So on the back side, that is behind the central sulcus, there's one more. and the space between the two is called the post-central gyrus. Post because it is posterior to it or behind it. And gyrus is the term that we use for that place which lies between two such folds, two such grooves is the gyrus. So this is the post-central gyrus. And we find that the specific projection of stimuli from the skin like touch, pain, or temperature is to the post-central gyrus. So this is the primary sensory area in the cortex. And when the message is conveyed here, it is interpreted as a sensory stimulus. But then what are the aspects of the stimulus that are interpreted here? The type of stimulus it is, whether it's touch or say pain or temperature, the location, whether it's on the foot or the hand, and its magnitude, whether it's mild or it is severe. So that is the type of interpretation we get from here, the type of awareness we get over here. Now you may say, well, that means that all the awareness is now over. We are become aware of the stimulus, but then that really is not enough because we need a lot more than that to be able to perceive the stimulus properly. And therefore, what happens is that from here, it then spreads to surrounding areas. And these surrounding areas are called the association areas. Now, what happens in these association areas is that this stimulus then gets related to our past experience, our past memory, and so on. And that leads to a proper interpretation of the sensory stimulus. And once that proper interpretation has taken place, then there is an emotional reaction to the stimulus and also a motor response, which means that some type of movement, some type of action takes place based on what the stimulus is. But before we go to that, let's see how is it that the position of the stimulus is located on the basis of the message reaching the postcentral gyrus. So how do we know whether the stimulus has been applied to the hand or to the foot? How do we know that? For that, there is a regional representation here, and it is on the opposite side of the body. That is, if the stimulus has been applied to the left side, then it is on the right side of the cerebral cortex that the message reaches. And if it has been applied to, say, the foot, then it reaches somewhere here at the top. And if it has been applied to the hand or the face, then it reaches somewhere at the bottom. Which means that the representation is upside down. Not only that, we find that the area that is dedicated in this primary sensory area to each part of the body is not in the same proportion as in the body itself. The area that it gets here is proportional to the sensitivity of that structure. For example, some of the most sensitive structures are the fingertips and the lips. They get a much bigger representation, whereas the thighs are not very sensitive and they get a much smaller representation. So the representation here is upside down and it is proportional to the sensitivity of that structure, or you can say that the sensitivity is there because it gets a bigger representation here, and therefore we become more sensitive to a stimulus applied here. And further, you find that in that area which is more sensitive, the density of the nerve endings is also much greater. We have more nerve endings present in these structures, more nerve endings and a greater representation in the cerebral cortex. Before we go further, let me just ask you a question. For that, maybe I can stop sharing for a moment so that you can see me bigger. Now, if you can see something in my pocket, what is it? You'll all say that it's a pen. But then let me take it out. It is not a pen, it is a pointer. Now, what you actually saw was only something shiny coming out of my pocket, which looks like the clip of a pen. And that is what you will perceive at the level of the post-central gyrus, that is the primary sensory area. What is it that I can see? I can see something shiny, which is about 3 or 4 centimeters long, and on top there is something circular. And it's only when it goes to the association areas that you link it to your past memory and experience. That a structure like this is generally a pen. And therefore, you say it is a pen. You've not seen the whole pen. You've not seen the whole of it. You've seen only a part of it, but from that, you have been able to interpret. And that's how sometimes we can make a mistake, but most of the time we are right. And we that's how the association areas come into play. So just trying to say why association areas are important. Not only that, for the same stimulus, there can be a different type of emotional response and a different type of motor response. And for this, I'll give you another example. Suppose there is a cat, and it faces a dog. Now, once they perceive each other, they have a tendency to sort of fight. The dog will start barking at the cat. So it has an emotional reaction, and it expresses that emotional reaction by barking. The dog has seen the cat and it starts barking. So there was an emotional response, and the motor response is it starts barking. But suppose in the same house, you have a pet cat and a pet dog. They don't bark. The other dog doesn't bark. It is accepted as a friend, as a member of the family. So the stimulus remains the same, but the emotional response is different. In fact, the dog will be helpful to the cat when it needs some help, and the other way around. So they become helpful to each other rather than fight. Also, to give you an example from the human world, suppose there's a lady in the market, and she's walking there with her child and her husband. Now, the child makes a gesture. It needs some attention. It needs some love. So, what does the lady do? She gives it a hug and gives it that love. Now, suppose the husband does the same thing. She's happy, but then she says, "What are you doing? So many people are watching us." And suppose a stranger does the same thing, she gets angry and may she reach for a shoe to hit this man. Now, the stimulus is the same, that is a loving gesture and demanding some love and attention. Uh, but the reaction is of three different types. The emotional reaction is different and the motor response is different. So, uh, one thing is that the stimulus has to be interpreted, and complete interpretation goes beyond what you actually see or hear or what touches us. The emotional response uh, is different, and then what one does is different. So there are three things involved here: a complete interpretation, which requires not only seeing something. Say, for example, if you see the sunrise, what is it that we see in terms of a description? That a shiny disk of this much diameter uh, somewhere in the sky. So that's what you see. But then the interpretation, it is the sun, because through experience we have learned that this type of structure is called a sun, and we know a lot more about it, how far away it is, how hot it is, what will happen after 1 hour, it will become brighter, it will become so on and so forth. Now that is the interpretation. But then the emotional response, early morning, sunrise, what a beautiful sunrise. That is the emotional response. And then what is the motor response? What do you feel like doing in response to it? Let me go out and see it properly. Or tomorrow I'll get up still earlier so that I can see it at a still earlier stage. Or let me go out for a walk. It's a beautiful sunrise. Let me go out for a morning walk. Now, these are different types of responses which you have. So one is just the registering the stimulus as it is. That is what is happening in the primary sensory area. But then after that, there's an emotional response to the stimulus. Sorry, after that, there is a total interpretation of the stimulus based on the stimulus going to the association areas. And then after that, there's also an emotional response to it. Coupled to it is an emotional response, which is because there are projections from these association areas in the cortex also to those areas which are linked to emotions. And then there's a motor response, that is action taken, because there are further projections from the association areas to the motor areas which control our muscles, etc. So total perception has all these components, and therefore perception is linked also to what decision is taken, and then what the emotional response is, and so on. This may give an idea that if the stimulus is the same, then the response will always be the same. But even that is not really true. This perception of the stimulus and response, etc., are further modified by one more thing. And that is, not only this message about the stimulus is conveyed upstairs, that is to the spinal cord and from there up to the brain, it also has an effect downstairs, which means that there are descending fibers also corresponding to the stimulus. So we have an ascending pathway. Which at some point will cross over to the opposite side, because the stimuli from the left side reach the right side and vice versa. And then from here it will spread to the association areas. And this point, where there's a relay of the information, one point at which almost all stimuli relay is somewhere in what is called the thalamus. And some sort of a crude perception of the stimulus may happen also at the thalamic level, but a proper consciousness, awareness of the stimulus and its interpretation happen only in the cerebral cortex. Now, along with this, we also have another set of fibers. Projection actually go not, do not go up, but go down. And these also eventually cross over. Now, these are descending, they are bringing the information down. So every time a stimulus goes up, it also sends some messages downstairs. Now, what does this do? What this does is to change the sensitivity of the person to this stimulus. They could make it sharper or they could make it less intense. For example, what do we mean when we say a person is paying attention to the stimulus? When a person is paying attention, then the stimulus is perceived better. On the other hand, when the person is not paying attention, or say, suppose a person on the path of yoga, he has pain, but he doesn't want to pay attention to it, and he brings those soothing thoughts to his mind, which make him relax, which make the pain much less painful, and make it the pain a pleasure. Well, I deserved it, and that's why it is happening, or that this pain is an opportunity for my spiritual growth. Now, how is that type of information coming down? That is coming down through these descending fibers, which is reducing the sensitivity, reducing the suffering associated with the painful stimulus, uh, making us perceive the stimulus or not perceive it at all. So selection of the stimulus. All that is happening because not only there is a pathway which ensures that the stimulus be perceived, but whether it will be perceived, how it will be perceived, what intensity it will be perceived, all that is affected by these fibers coming down and changing the sensitivity of this to the stimulus. So all these neurons which are affecting the response to the stimulus at different levels are also further influenced by these descending fibers. And the result of this is that in general, we are able to perceive, in spite of having so many stimuli around us, we are able to perceive only those stimuli which are not very monotonous, because a continuous monotonous stimulus firstly leads to an adaptation at the receptor level. After some time, the stimulus does not produce the same type of response. The response keeps going down. The receptor potential itself reduces after some time. So most receptors adapt, and among the receptors which show maximum adaptation are receptors for touch. And that is why we are not aware of the presence of our clothes, because although they are touching us all the time, we are not aware of that touch. The touch receptors adapt to it. And that's why we are not aware of this stimulus. Uh, and therefore, if the stimulus is non-monotonous, then you know that adaptation is much less. If it's continuous, then the adaptation will be more. But then a non-monotonous stimulus also perhaps has implications in terms of the descending pathway. Further, what we call attention also depends upon what is happening here at the cortical level, and that affects these descending fibers. And another thing which is important is that stimulus is perceived better if it has no competition, which means if there are too many stimuli coming, then some are likely to be selected and others are likely to be neglected. So without any competition. For example, it's a common experience that when we sit down to meditate, we start hearing all types of sounds. The fan making some sound, somebody blowing a horn outside on the road, that reaching us, or the tick tock of the clock. All these stimuli we become aware of when we are meditating, when we actually don't want them. Why that happens is because during meditation, we have been able to put our mind into a certain mode of silence. We have deliberately reduced the sensory stimuli to their minimum. We sit in a room with subdued lighting, a room which is quite silent and quiet, in a quiet place with subdued lighting, on a seat which is neither too soft nor too warm, in a posture which is relaxed, although erect. Now, we have done all these things. And one of the things which happens as a result of this is that the sensory stimuli are reduced to the minimum. And when sensory stimuli are reduced to the minimum, the sound stimuli, these stimuli which send sound waves to us, like the fan or the clock, they were already always there, but then we didn't notice them because they had competition from so many other stimuli. The other stimuli were sort of masking these sounds. But when our mind is quiet, then even if we don't want to pay attention to these sounds, we start paying attention, or rather, we start hearing them, and then we have to make an effort not to pay attention to these sounds because of this unmasking effect. So basically, there are three things which determine the stimulus, how we'll whether we'll perceive it or not. One is uh, we'll perceive it if it is non-monotonous. Secondly, if we are paying attention to it, and thirdly, if it has no competing stimuli. This idea of competing stimuli making a stimulus less effective is also something which we apply in medicine. For example, if a person has pain, then sometimes we apply a local ointment which produces some sort of a cooling sensation or a strong sensation on the skin, like the balms, etc. Now, what they do is they provide in the same area of the skin where there is a painful stimulus originating, they create at that same place a competing stimulus. And therefore, we start perceiving that, and the pain stimulus then recedes to the background. Now, in case of the pain stimulus, actually the descending fibers have another role, and that is to release pain-reducing substances. And that we shall see a little later when we talk in a little greater detail about pain. So with this now, I'll go to the PowerPoint presentation. But in the meantime, if there are any questions related to what we have talked so far, I can take those up before I go to the PowerPoint. But not any questions related to the nervous system in general, questions related to what we have talked today so far. Any questions? If there are no questions, then what I'll do is I'll go to the PowerPoint. Let me start with a quotation from Oliver Wendell Holmes, an eminent physician who practiced in the Boston area in the 19th century. Then mark the cloven sphere that holds all thought in its mysterious folds, that feels sensation's faintest thrill, and flashes forth the sovereign will. Think on the stormy world that dwells, locked in its dim and clustering cells, the lightning gleams of power it sheds along its slender glassy threads. So this cloven sphere refers to the brain with all types of grooves. And what does it hold? All thought in its mysterious folds. Well, thought doesn't originate there, but that is how it seems. That feels sensation's faintest thrill. So the stimulus reaching there and leading to a thrill, and also leading to a will. I want to do this in response to this stimulus. All that is happening there. That feels sensation's faintest thrill and flashes forth the sovereign will. Think on the stormy world that dwells, locked in its dim and clustering cells. So, with all types of stimuli coming and all types of thoughts coming and going, think of the storm that is going on within this structure. It's dim and clustering cells. In a way, dim because by themselves the nerve cells are not very intelligent. That is one way of looking at it. And clustering because the brain is jam packed with these cells, the great density of these cells. The lightning gleams of power it sheds along its slender glassy threads. The gleams of power, electrical impulses that it sends along slender glassy threads, the nerve fibers. Now, this picture shows the primary sensory area. This is the surface of the brain. And from here, you can see this cauliflower-like structure, the cerebellum, about which we shall talk in one of the subsequent sessions. Apparently, a little isolated from the brain, but then a part of the brain and a very important part of the brain. And what it does, we'll see some of it in a subsequent session. But sticking to the cortical surface, the cerebral cortex, we find that it has all these grooves, and there is one more or less in the center. This is the central sulcus. And the cerebellum is towards the backside. And so what is behind the central sulcus is the post-central gyrus. This is the primary sensory area, which we were talking about. And in this sensory area, there's a representation of the body, which is upside down. That is the head and the hands down and the feet on top. And this is what shows you that representation, upside down representation. Find that the lips are here. The face as a whole is here, occupying such a big area. And the hand again is occupying a big area, particularly the fingers and the thumb even more than the other rest of the fingers. And then here you have the leg and the foot. So this is the upside down representation. and you find that the thigh, etc., are hardly there. They do have a representation somewhere, but hidden somewhere in the middle, hardly showing there. So this is what is called the sensory homunculus. And how do we know about it? Uh, Much of this came from the studies of Penfield and Rasmussen. Penfield was a neurosurgeon, and in neurosurgery, very often you can operate upon the brain under local anesthesia, which means that the person is conscious. You only anesthetized the coverings of the brain by using local anesthesia. The person is still conscious. And that is possible because although the brain is what we think perceives the pain, the brain itself is not sensitive to uh, being cut. The brain itself doesn't show any sensitivity to pain. You can cut the brain so long as you anesthetized in the surroundings, that is, surrounding coverings, you can operate on the brain. So that's the type of surgery he was very often doing under local anesthesia. Now, he had an opportunity to observe the surface of the brain while the person is still conscious. And then what he did was used an electrical stimulator to stimulate different parts of the brain. And when he stimulated the postcentral gyrus with mild electrical stimuli, when he stimulated lower down, then the person said that I'm feeling something in my lips, for example. When he did it here, the person said I'm seeing something happening to my feet. Now, and in this way, he could map the entire homunculus. Now, how does this electrical stimulation lead to this type of an experience? It leads to this type of an experience because the message reaches here normally as an electrical impulse. We saw that the language of the nervous system is electrical, so the message reaches here as an electrical impulse. In contrast, you can do the opposite, that is actually apply an electrical stimulus from outside. And the brain then interprets that as if something is happening to that part of the body because the experience is that whenever there's electrical activity in this region, then there is some sensory stimulus somewhere in the body. And where in the body, that seems to depend upon which part is getting that electrical activity. So you can mimic that electrical activity, which uh, happens here as a result of a real stimulus by just applying an electrical stimulus here. And that's how you could map it. Not only that, when he went to association areas surrounding this, then he found that he not only got the location of the stimulus, but he also got a whole story around the stimulus. Then the person recollected, yes, I had gone to such and such place, such and such day, and this is what happened there, and so on. So he could give a whole story surrounding the stimulus. So that's how we learned about the association areas, that how they are playing a part in completing the interpretation and giving the emotional response and so on. So stimuli of the past have been stored as memories and experience in the association areas, and uh, that's how every sensory stimulus is actually coupled with those. Many of those things might have been forgotten, but when you stimulate electrically, then all those hidden memories also seem to come out. Now we come to a stimulus that we are all quite interested in, and that is pain. Why we are interested in is because pain is the commonest symptom which doctors and nurses are told about. A pain is an unpleasant experience, and it is actually a warning signal because when we have that pain, when we experience pain, it usually corresponds to a stimulus which is actually, or at least potentially, that has the possibility of being harmful to the body. But then pain is one thing, suffering is another. All pain need not necessarily lead to suffering. But before we go to that, the pain and suffering that, as I said, pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. Before we go to that part, let's see a little more of the biological aspect of pain. Biologically, pain is of two types, fast and slow. Now, here is the pathway for fast pain. Uh, Here is the uh, fiber originating in the skin somewhere as a free nerve ending, bringing the information about a painful stimulus to the spinal cord. And in the spinal cord, you can see it goes to the opposite side because the stimulus from the left side actually reaches the right side of the brain and vice versa. So it's right here crossing over to the other side. And on the way, it is giving some projections to different areas which are concerned with reflexes that take place in response to the pain, uh, emotional responses in response to the pain, and from the thalamus, it finally goes to the sensory cortex. So much of the projection of the fast pain is specific in nature, going to the primary sensory area and then from there to the association areas. And why is it called fast pain? It is called fast pain because it travels via nerve fibers which are fast conducting. They conduct this at a high speed to the sensory area and therefore takes less time for the pain to be perceived. That's fast pain. In contrast, we find that slow pain is conveyed by another type of nerve fibers. These are called A fibers, and these are C fibers. These C fibers are slow conducting. Uh, the pathway to start with is similar, and in fact, the same stimulus may generally stimulates both A type of fibers and C type of fibers. So one aspect of this pain travels fast, another aspect of this pain travels slowly. And what these two aspects are, we shall see in a moment. So there is a slow projection, uh, again going there, but here there's one difference. The projections to the surrounding structures and diffuse projection in the cerebral cortex is much greater. So this is a relatively non-specific pathway, which is conveyed by these slow fibers. And one can understand that since the diffuse projection is much greater in case of slow pain is more likely to keep us awake than fast pain. Now, what is the different character of these two pains? The fast pain is sharp and pricking in character, whereas the slow pain is dull, aching, and burning in character. We see some of these differences in the next slide. So fast pain is carried by fast conducting nerve fibers, the A type, whereas slow pain is carried by slow conducting nerve fibers, the C type. Fast pain is well localized because the projection is to the specific area. Much of the projection is to the specific sensory area, which interprets the localization of the stimulus, the primary sensory area. Whereas here, much of the projection is diffuse in nature, and therefore the localization of this pain is poor. It's poorly localized. We don't know exactly where the pain is, but we just feel that the pain is there. The localization is rather poor. It's there, but it is poorly localized. It's not sharply defined. This pain is sharp and pricking in character, sharp or pricking in character, whereas the slow pain is dull, aching, or burning in character. Uh, Fast pain is carried predominantly by the specific pathways, which give us specific information of the type of stimulus, the intensity of the stimulus, and the location on the body where the stimulus has been applied. Whereas slow pain is carried predominantly by the non-specific pathways, that is, the pathways which lead to a diffuse projection and keep us awake. Fast conducting nerve fibers are blocked most easily by pressure. We can block the conduction through these fibers, which are traveling from the skin to the spinal cord by pressure, whereas the slow conducting nerve fibers are blocked most easily by local anesthetics. Now let's see how it correlates with our experience. Suppose our finger gets caught in a door. It's a painful experience. What is our first response? Our first response is to clench our, apply pressure. We hold the finger that has gone tightly with the fist of the other hand. We hold it and press it tight. And that seems to reduce the pain. That reduces the pain because the fast conducting nerve fibers are blocked most easily by pressure. So instinctively, we apply pressure to that area. We say that the finger which has been caught in a door, we press it hard with the fist of the other hand. We hold it in the fist and press it hard, and that seems to reduce the pain. But later on, the slow pain will also appear. That does not seem to be affected much. That dull pain, aching, burning pain, which is poorly localized, which appears a little later because of the slow pathway, takes longer to be experienced. That pain is not much affected. That will still be there. Now, how about the slow conducting fibers, which are most easily blocked by local anesthetics? Suppose the doctor has given a local anesthetic at a place before doing some minor surgery. And after the anesthetic has had some effect, he starts using the knife. The person can still feel where the knife is moving. So this sharp pricking pain, which is the fast pain, immediately the person knows this is where the doctor is moving the knife. It may not be very painful because of the local anesthetic, but all the same, these nerves have not been completely blocked, and therefore the person knows where the knife is moving. But then, following that, the surgery continues, but the person does not experience the dull, aching, or burning pain at all because these fibers have been blocked by the local anesthetic more effectively. Now we come to another interesting phenomenon, the referred pain. Normally, we experience pain only from the skin, but sometimes internal organs also send painful messages, like, say, for example, the intestine. And the pathway is similar, but then how is it that we feel as if the pain is coming from the skin? Now let's see that. That is called referred pain. So the pain is in the because of say an obstruction in the intestines. Hmm? Say the intestine is there, or the pain is because of an obstruction in the ureter. Now these are internal organs, or the pain is because of something happening in the gallbladder. Now these are internal organs, and inflammation there, damage there, sends a painful message, and the areas in the spinal cord to which it is sent are again common. It has an independent pathway, but say in case of the appendix, suppose this is a painful appendix, an inflamed appendix. The message is conveyed to that part of the spinal cord to which the impulses arising from the umbilicus also convey the messages, painful messages to the spinal cord. So the if there's a pain in the skin around the umbilicus, that goes via this pathway. If the pain is because of inflammation in the appendix, that goes via this pathway. Now, the result is that it's in the same area, and when the pain goes up, we interpret it as if it's coming from the skin because it is coming from the same part of the spinal cord. The region stimulated in the spinal cord is the same. And normally we get painful stimuli from the skin, not from the appendix. So the interpretation is as if it is coming from the skin. Because the cerebral cortex, when it reaches the cerebral cortex, it reaches this areas which is similar to that around the appendix, around the umbilicus. And therefore, the interpretation is as if it is coming from the umbilicus. And therefore, to start with, pain from the appendix is felt around the umbilicus. It's only when the organ gets more inflamed that the pain gets more localized to a region immediately above the appendix, but still it is felt in the skin rather than in the appendix. In the same way, pain from the gallbladder goes to that part of the spinal cord from where painful messages come normally from the shoulder tip on the right side. And therefore, the pain is more likely to be felt on the right shoulder rather than in the gallbladder. So the pain gets referred to a part of the body which has which sort of has the same nerve roots as the uh, area of the skin. So the area of the skin which has conveys information through the same type of nerve roots as the internal organ. If the internal organ sends a painful message, it is interpreted as if it is coming from the skin. So this is what referred pain is. A similar phenomenon takes place after the amputation of a limb. So this person has an above knee amputation. So this leg is no longer there. So this is the cut thigh, and the nerves fibers which were here, they were also naturally cut. And in fact, when those nerve fibers start regenerating, they sometimes regenerate, and since they have nowhere to go down, they just spread here and form a dense collection of sensory nerve fibers at the tip of the thigh. And because there's a greater density of these nerve fibers which have regenerated but didn't have any space to go down, this becomes very sensitive. And therefore, if a painful stimulus is applied here, or even if it is not applied here, it just as a touch stimulus, that itself becomes painful because of this greater density. And when this is conveyed, the, the pathway is the same as the pathway which was used for a painful stimulus to the leg and the foot. The painful stimuli to the leg and the foot were conveyed by the same set of nerve fibers by which now the stimulus is going from the uh, tip of the thigh. But then the person still interprets it as if it is coming from the leg and the foot. The leg and the foot don't exist anymore, but the interpretation still remains the same. And this is what is called the phantom limb phenomenon. The person says, I'm feeling pain in the leg, which is no longer there. How is it that I'm feeling pain there? Now that happens because of this. This is called the phantom leg phenomenon. So the pain is still perceived in the non-existent leg. Now we talked about the descending fibers. Descending fibers are of great importance in case of the painful stimuli. And there's an endogenous, that is an inbuilt pain relief system. So these descending fibers have an inhibitory influence on the perception of pain. So this pain relief system is operated by the descending fibers, and it is activated by another competing stimulus, a severe pain, and by positive thoughts and feelings. Now, this we have seen how another competing stimulus, say applying a balm on the skin, helps. That helps because of these descending fibers. No, that helps because now there's a competing stimulus, and therefore these fibers get a little more chance to work. It also is activated by severe pain. When the pain is very severe, then also uh, the activation of these descending fibers is greater, which means that the severe pain tends to disappear. And by positive thoughts and feelings, uh, whether of the yogic and the spiritual type or any other types of positive self-soothing thoughts and feelings, could help in reducing the pain. For example, if a soldier has been injured in the battlefield, he feels less pain because he feels that he is experiencing this pain because he was there for a noble cause to serve the country. Or an athlete who is more concerned with the game, with the competition than with the pain, if he gets injured, he doesn't feel that much pain. Or if in a road accident, in a serious road accident, the person initially does not feel much pain because his first priority is that, will I survive? That is what he's thinking about, not about the pain that he's feeling. So various types of thoughts and feelings also perhaps act through this endogenous pain relief system, these descending fibers which get activated by any of these things, and that's how the pain becomes much less. An important neurotransmitter employed by the descending pain fibers are the endorphins. Endorphins are very similar to the strong painkiller morphine. Morphine, you can say, is one of the, in fact, the strongest painkiller known, and these endorphins are very similar to it. So we have a safe uh, supply of endorphins available within the body when it is required. And It's released in minute amounts at the place exactly where it is needed, when it is needed, doesn't lead to the type of harmful addiction that morphine can lead to. But all the same, there is a certain type of addiction that can take place. For example, not only pain, but also exercise releases endorphins. And if a person takes physical exercise every day, including yogic postures, the person becomes uh, somewhat addicted to it. And the day he does not, uh, say, do those yoga asanas, he feels as if something is missing today, something has gone wrong, because the person has developed a sort of an addiction to that activity. Now, how does now the fact that severe pain also activates these descending fibers uh, and therefore relieves pain. So severe pain tends to disappear on its own because of the greater activation of these descending fibers, which have an inhibitory effect on the pain. This has been expressed beautifully in a couplet by the eminent poet Ghalib. इशरत कतरा है दरिया में फना हो जाना दर्द का हद से गुजरना है दवा हो जाना. What it means is just as a drop of water, इशरत कतरा, uh, gets lost in a river, दरिया में फना हो जाना. Loses the drop, loses its identity in the river. इशरत कतरा है दरिया में फना हो जाना, दर्द का हद से गुजरना है दवा हो जाना. When pain crosses a certain limit, when it goes beyond a certain limit, uh, when it crosses all boundaries, then the pain itself becomes a medicine, it becomes a painkiller. So when pain crosses a limit, when pain becomes very severe, the pain cures itself. It works like remedy for the pain. This is a picture from one of my storybooks. Kavya makes up her mind. Now here is a child who got hurt in the play field, and now she has been dressed up by the nurse. The child is still feeling pain here, and the nurse then tries to sort of tell this keep this child in good humor and tells her, "Give me your hand, let me kiss your hand." And then asks her, "Now is the pain gone?" And the child smiles and says, "Yes." So she says, "I kissed your hand and the pain has gone from the knee. Isn't it magic? अब तो जादू भी देख लिया, अब तो हंसो." So, see, now how is it that this does it? This does it just expression of love and concern. That itself can also reduce the pain. And therefore, the part of the body which has been kissed doesn't really matter. So severe pain cures itself. Love can reduce the pain. Love can cure the pain. And laughter can cure pain. Norman Cousins cured severe pain of ankylosing spondylitis uh, by just watching comedies. The whole story behind it, which I'll not go into, but then this is also the story is available. At least some parts of the story are available in a video on the uh, Yes Spirituality YouTube channel. You'll find it easily on the Yes Talks. So this person cured his pain by using laughter. What he did was he started watching comedies instead of using painkillers, and he documented that 10 minutes of laughter gave him about 2 hours of pain-free existence. Then the spiritual approach. Sri Ramakrishna got throat cancer, which was painful, and his cancer was probably a sequel to what is called clergyman's throat. People who speak a lot because they are speaking to lots of people, like the clergyman. And Sri Ramakrishna used to speak to a lot of people to counsel them, to advise them, to guide them. They develop a throat which has a hoarse voice, and that is what the clergyman's throat. With further uh, complication of this could be throat cancer, and that is what he got. And it was a painful condition. And in that condition, the doctors advised him total silence, which they thought will help him live a little longer. But then he refused to go silent. He said, "So long as I'm alive, I'll go on doing what I'm supposed to do. I'll not stop helping these people. I'll go on talking." And so he went on preaching and talking to people um, uh, in spite of this pain. The pain did not affect him. He did not suffer because of the pain, and that's why he could do it. Sri Aurobindo, during his last illness, was asked by the doctor, "What are you suffering from?" And Sri Aurobindo said, "Doctor, I don't suffer." So pain is inevitable, illness is inevitable, incurable illness is also inevitable finally in life, but suffering is always optional. Much of the pictures in this realistic looking pictures were taken from Todor and Grabowski's Principles of Anatomy and Physiology. Suggested reading this popular book, The Human Machine, and these two textbooks, Fundamentals of Physiology and Understanding Medical Physiology, if you want greater detail. This is Sri Aurobindo Ashram, Delhi branch, a picture postcard view of the place where I live and work and from where I'm speaking, to which you're all welcome. Uh, Please feel free to send your questions or comments on yes@yesspirituality.com. Gratitude to the Mother and Sri Aurobindo for making these sessions possible. Thank you all for being there. Any questions?
How is the pain tolerance level different among different people?
I mean, we are all constituted differently. That, of course, is true for all stimuli. Secondly, the stimuli, the same stimulus affects different people differently, partly because of age. As we age, the sensitivity of most receptors tends to go down. Say, for example, the taste receptors. That's the best example to understand this. Uh, the taste receptors, the child is very sensitive to taste and therefore says, I like this, I don't like this. Whereas when the person grows up, the person is told this is a healthy food and you should have it, even if the person doesn't like the taste much. The person eats it and also doesn't find it as unpleasant as the person found it as a child. The sensitivity of the taste receptors goes down. In general, our sensitivity of even pain receptors and other receptors goes down as we get older. And then, of course, there is that influence because of our thoughts and feelings. So we learn to sort of look at pain differently, say on the spiritual path. We learn to look at pain differently as something that is essential, that is an opportunity for spiritual growth, and to some extent also needed because if we had only pleasant experiences in life, perhaps we would forget the true purpose of life. And therefore, some unpleasant experiences are also needed. And one of these unpleasant experiences could come in the form of physical pain.
So we can, I think, close today's session with a moment of peaceful silence.